Sir, you can't sit here, the airport manager said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the steady hum of rolling suitcases and distant boarding calls, and for a brief second, the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath as the man in the worn coat slowly lifted his eyes. The overhead lights cast a pale, almost sterile glow across the polished floor, reflecting the contrast between polished shoes and scuffed boots, between tailored authority and quiet presence. Ethan Cole didn't move. He sat on the edge of a metal bench near gate C12, shoulders slightly hunched, hands resting loosely around a folded piece of paper that most people had already dismissed as trash. Around him, travelers rushed past in a blur of movement, carry-ons rattling, coffee cups clutched, phones pressed to ears, but a small circle of attention had begun to form, subtle at first, then tightening as curiosity replaced indifference. Richard Hayes stood tall in his navy suit, the airport badge clipped neatly against his chest catching the light every time he shifted. He was used to control, used to order, used to deciding, in a matter of seconds, who belonged in his terminal and who didn't. And to him, the answer right now felt obvious. "I'm asking you one more time," Richard said, slower now, each word deliberate, as if speaking to someone who didn't quite understand the rules. "This area is for ticketed passengers only." A few people nearby slowed their pace, pretending to check departure screens while their eyes flickered back. Someone adjusted their grip on a phone, angling it just enough. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. There was no anger in it, no visible defiance, just a stillness that didn't match the situation. He glanced down briefly at the paper in his hands, smoothing one edge with his thumb, then looked back up. "I know," he said quietly. His voice didn't carry far, but it landed. Not loud, not forceful, just certain. Richard exhaled through his nose, the kind of breath that came from long days and short patience. He stepped closer, the faint scent of cologne cutting through the recycled air. "Then you also know you can't stay," he replied, his tone tightening, eyes scanning the man in front of him. The worn jacket, the dust along the cuffs, the shoes that had clearly walked more miles than most people in this terminal would ever see. Ethan shifted slightly, just enough to sit a little straighter, as if grounding himself. "I'm waiting for a flight," he said. A pause followed. Not dramatic, not loud, but noticeable. A businessman nearby let out a short, disbelieving breath. Someone behind him whispered something under their voice. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line, the hint of a smile forming, though there was no warmth in it. "A flight," he repeated, as if testing the words for weight. He glanced briefly at the departure board, then back at Ethan. "You have a boarding pass?" he asked. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he unfolded the paper in his hands with careful precision, smoothing the creases as if they mattered. The edges were worn, slightly bent, but the print was still clear beneath the surface. He held it loosely, not offering it, not hiding it, just letting it exist between them. The ambient noise of the terminal seemed to dip again, or maybe it was just the way attention narrowed, pulling everything inward. Richard didn't reach for it. Not yet. His eyes flicked over it quickly, dismissively, as if he had already decided what it was before truly seeing it. "That's not how this works," he said, shaking his head once, more to himself than to Ethan. "You don't just sit here and—" He stopped, not because he ran out of words, but because something about the moment didn't resolve the way he expected. Ethan's expression hadn't changed. No frustration. No urgency. Just that same quiet steadiness, like someone who had already accepted the outcome of a conversation that hadn't finished yet. A rolling suitcase clipped the corner of the bench as someone hurried past, muttering an apology that neither man acknowledged. The world kept moving, but this moment stayed still. Richard straightened, adjusting his jacket with a quick tug, reclaiming the space with posture alone. "Sir," he said again, firmer this time, "this is your final warning." Ethan looked past him for a fraction of a second, toward the large glass windows where planes taxied under the late afternoon sun, engines humming low and distant, then brought his eyes back. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said, calm as ever. And somehow, that made the silence that followed feel heavier than anything else. Richard Hayes held his position for a moment longer, as if the weight of the situation might shift if he simply stood firm enough, but instead, the tension settled deeper into the space between them, thick and unmoving like the stale air near the ceiling vents. He glanced over his shoulder briefly, catching sight of two security officers stationed near the escalator about 30 feet away, their posture relaxed but attentive, the kind of presence that blended into the environment until it was needed. When he turned back, his expression had hardened, not out of anger, but out of something colder, something practiced. "You are disrupting the flow of this terminal," he said, his voice now measured, professional, stripped of any trace of earlier irritation. "People are watching. This is not the place for—" He paused, not finishing the sentence, but letting the implication hang in the air. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his grip on the paper again, folding it once more with care, aligning the edges as if the act itself required precision. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, almost disconnected from the urgency that Richard was trying to impose. A child passed by pulling a bright red suitcase, the wheels rattling loudly against the tile, and for a brief second, the sound broke the stillness before fading into the distance. "I am not causing a problem," Ethan said finally, his voice steady, almost gentle. "I am just waiting." Richard let out a short breath, the kind that signaled a decision had already been made. He lifted his hand slightly, not pointing, but gesturing in a way that created distance. "You might think that," he replied, "but this airport runs on order, on expectations. And right now you do not meet them." A few feet away, a woman adjusted her scarf and leaned subtly toward the scene, her eyes fixed, her body angled as if she did not want to miss what came next. Another man pretended to scroll through his phone, though his thumb had stopped moving. The quiet circle of attention had grown tighter, more defined. Ethan's eyes followed Richard's gesture for a moment, then returned to his face. There was something almost reflective in his expression now, like he was not just hearing the words, but measuring them. "Expectations change," he said softly. Richard shook his head, a small, dismissive motion, but there was a flicker of impatience beneath it. He reached toward his radio, clipped neatly at his waist, his fingers brushing the edge before pressing the button. "Security to gate C12, he said, his voice calm and clear, carrying just enough authority to be heard without raising it. "I need assistance with a non-compliant individual." The words landed heavier than they sounded, formal and distant, reducing the moment to a category, a procedure. As he released the button, the faint crackle of static filled the brief silence that followed. Somewhere in the distance, a voice responded, muffled and indistinct, but moving closer. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in thought, as if acknowledging the next step in a process he had already seen play out before. His fingers brushed lightly over the surface of the folded paper, tracing the edge, then stilling. The overhead announcement system chimed softly, followed by a calm voice listing departures and gate changes, the routine rhythm of travel continuing without interruption. "You do not have to do this," Ethan said, not as a plea, but as a statement, quiet and even. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, though his posture did not change. "It is already being done," he replied. The two security officers had begun to move now, their steps steady, their presence growing more defined with each second, their uniforms catching the light as they approached through the flow of passengers. People shifted subtly to make space, conversations lowering, attention sharpening. The world narrowed again, focusing on a single point in the middle of a busy terminal. Ethan watched them for a moment, then looked back at Richard, his expression unchanged, calm in a way that felt almost out of place. "Then I will stay," he said quietly. And for a brief second, before the officers reached them, before any words were exchanged, before anything was resolved, Richard felt something unfamiliar press against his certainty, not doubt exactly, but something close enough to make the moment feel less solid than it had a minute before. The two security officers slowed as they approached, their presence calm but unmistakable, the kind of authority that did not need to raise its voice to be understood, and for a brief moment the flow of travelers around Gate C12 seemed to bend around them like water around a stone. One of them, a tall man with a neatly pressed uniform and a steady expression, glanced first at Richard, then at Ethan, his eyes moving quickly, assessing without judgment. "Sir," he said to Richard, his tone respectful but neutral, "what seems to be the issue?" Richard did not hesitate. He stepped slightly forward, reclaiming control of the conversation with a practiced ease. "This individual has been asked multiple times to leave the gate area," he said, his voice measured, each word placed carefully. "He does not have proper authorization to remain here, and he is refusing to comply." The officer nodded once, absorbing the information, then turned his attention to Ethan. The shift was subtle, but noticeable. The air changed again, not tense exactly, but expectant. "Sir," the officer said, his voice steady, "do you have a boarding pass or identification for travel today?" Ethan looked at him, not with resistance, but with the same quiet composure he had held from the beginning. For a second, he said nothing. Then he slowly unfolded the paper in his hands once more, smoothing it out against his knee before holding it up, not directly offering it, but making it visible. The officer stepped closer, just enough to read the print. His eyes moved across the surface, scanning, pausing, then narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in concentration. The second officer leaned in just a fraction, trying to catch the same details without interrupting. Around them, the quiet circle of onlookers tightened further. A woman near the charging station lowered her phone just enough to get a clearer angle. A man in a gray jacket shifted his stance, his attention now fully fixed on the exchange. Richard crossed his arms, watching the interaction with a confidence that bordered on certainty, as if the outcome had already been decided long before the officers arrived. "You can see for yourself," he said, a hint of impatience slipping into his tone. "That is not a valid pass for this terminal." The first officer did not respond immediately. He continued to look at the paper, then glanced up at Ethan, then back down again, as if something did not quite align. "Where are you traveling to today, sir?" he asked. Ethan's answer came without hesitation. "San Francisco," he said. The words settled into the space, simple, direct. The officer nodded slowly, processing. "And what airline?" he asked. Ethan's gaze remained steady. "Mine," he said. The response was quiet, almost lost beneath the distant announcement of a boarding call from another gate, but it landed with a weight that was difficult to ignore. A faint ripple moved through the nearby crowd, not loud enough to become a reaction, but enough to shift the energy. Richard let out a short, dismissive laugh, shaking his head as if the answer confirmed everything he had already believed. "That is exactly what I am talking about," he said, turning slightly toward the officers. "He is making statements that do not align with reality. This is not a conversation anymore. This is a disruption." The officer's eyes flicked briefly toward Richard, then back to Ethan. There was no judgment in his expression, only a careful attention, as if he was choosing each next step with precision. "Sir," he said again to Ethan, "can you clarify what you mean by that?" Ethan lowered the paper slightly, his fingers still holding it with quiet care. For the first time, he shifted his posture, not away, but forward, as if meeting the moment instead of waiting for it. The overhead lights caught the edge of the paper, reflecting a faint glint along the printed seal near the corner, something small, easily overlooked unless someone was actually looking. "I mean," Ethan said, his voice calm, steady, and unchanged, "I am not waiting for permission to be here." The officer's gaze dropped once more to the document, this time lingering just a fraction longer, his expression tightening in a way that suggested recognition was beginning to form, not fully realized, but close enough to shift the balance of the moment. And in that small, quiet pause, something invisible began to tilt. The officer's fingers shifted slightly against the edge of the paper, not taking it yet, but no longer dismissing it either, and that small hesitation did not go unnoticed as Richard Hayes straightened his posture, the confidence in his stance tightening into something more rigid, something that needed to be reinforced rather than assumed. "Is there a problem?" Richard asked, his tone controlled, but edged now with impatience that he was no longer bothering to hide. The officer did not answer right away. His eyes moved once more across the printed surface, slower this time, tracing the lines, the seal, the formatting that most people would never look twice at. The second officer shifted his weight beside him, glancing between the document and Ethan, sensing the change but not yet understanding it. Around them, the quiet had deepened into something heavier. Even the rolling announcements overhead felt distant, as if the sound itself had stepped back to make room. "Sir," the officer said finally, his voice still even, but carrying a different tone now, more deliberate. "Where did you obtain this pass?" Ethan did not look at the paper when he answered. His eyes stayed forward, calm, steady, grounded in a way that contrasted sharply with the tightening energy around him. "It was issued this morning," he said. Richard let out a breath that bordered on a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. He took a step closer, closing the space again, his presence asserting itself with renewed force. "That is not possible," he said, his voice firmer now, louder, drawing a few more glances from across the terminal. "All access in this area is verified through our system. If it was issued, it would be in the records. And I can assure you, it is not." The officer's gaze flicked toward Richard, then back to Ethan, as if weighing the two statements side by side. His thumb pressed lightly against the corner of the document, testing the texture, the thickness, the authenticity that could not be faked easily. The second officer leaned in a fraction more, his brow tightening as he caught sight of the same detail, the small embossed mark near the edge that reflected the overhead light in a way that standard prints did not. "Can I see that?" the first officer asked. This time, Ethan extended the paper without hesitation. The motion was smooth, unguarded, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. The officer took it carefully, holding it at an angle where the light struck the surface fully, revealing details that had been invisible from a distance. For a second, nothing happened. Then his posture shifted. Not dramatically, not enough for most people to notice, but enough. His shoulders straightened, his grip on the document adjusting slightly, more careful now, more aware. Richard saw it. And for the first time, something in his expression flickered, not doubt exactly, but a brief interruption in the certainty he had been holding on to. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower now, controlled again, but no longer effortless. The officer did not answer immediately. His eyes moved once more across the print, then lifted to Ethan, holding there for a second longer than before. "Sir," he said slowly, choosing each word, "this pass indicates executive clearance." The words did not land loudly, but they carried. A faint shift rippled through the nearby crowd, subtle but unmistakable, like a current moving through still water. Richard's jaw tightened. "That is not possible," he repeated, though this time the words lacked the same weight. "There is no record of—" He stopped. Not because he chose to, but because the officer was already turning the document slightly, angling it toward him. "You might want to take a closer look," the officer said. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping forward, his eyes dropping to the paper, scanning quickly at first, then slowing, his focus sharpening as details began to register. The seal. The formatting. The signature line. His breath caught. Just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough. He looked up at Ethan, then back down again, as if the answer might change if he checked one more time. The terminal noise seemed to fade further, replaced by a silence that felt almost intentional. Ethan remained exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, as if none of this surprised him, as if he had already seen the moment unfold long before anyone else realized what it meant. And somewhere between the paper in Richard's hands and the quiet certainty in Ethan's eyes, the balance shifted again, more sharply this time, like something unseen had finally crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Richard Hayes stared at the document in his hands, and for the first time since this moment began, the certainty that had carried him through every decision seemed to hesitate, not collapse, but pause, as if something underneath it had shifted just enough to make him aware of it. The embossed seal caught the overhead light again, a subtle glint that moved as he adjusted his grip, and suddenly it was no longer just a piece of paper. It had weight now. Context. Meaning that extended beyond the moment. This does not make sense, Richard said, though his voice no longer carried the same authority it had minutes ago. It was quieter, more inward, as if he was trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed to be true. The first officer remained still, watching him carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing the realization to unfold at its own pace. The second officer shifted slightly, his posture more attentive now, his gaze moving between Richard and Ethan with a growing awareness that the situation had changed in a way that required precision. Around them, the silence had become something else entirely. It was no longer curiosity. It was focus. People were no longer pretending to look away. They were watching openly now, their attention anchored to the exchange in a way that made the space feel smaller than it was. Ethan stood from the bench slowly, the movement calm, deliberate, his coat settling around him as he rose. He did not step forward. He did not reach for the document. He simply stood, meeting Richard's gaze with the same quiet steadiness that had never left him. "It makes sense," Ethan said, his voice even, not raised, not defensive, just present. Richard looked up at him, and for a brief second, there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, something uncertain, something searching. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding," Richard began, but the words did not finish with the same confidence they started. The officer stepped in slightly then, not aggressively, but with purpose, his tone still respectful, but now carrying a firmness that matched the gravity of the moment. "Sir," he said to Richard, "this clearance is issued at the highest level within this airline system." He paused, letting the implication settle. "It is not something that appears without authorization." Richard swallowed, the motion small but visible. His grip on the document tightened just slightly, then loosened again, as if he was aware of how it looked. He glanced back down, scanning the signature line once more, the name printed there, clear, unmistakable. His breath slowed, then caught again, barely perceptible. He looked back at Ethan, really looked this time, not at the coat, not at the surface, but at the man standing in front of him. The stillness. The composure. The absence of reaction where there should have been frustration or anger. It did not fit the narrative he had built. Not anymore. "You should have identified yourself," Richard said, though the words came out softer, less like an accusation and more like an attempt to regain footing. Ethan's expression did not change. "I did," he replied. The simplicity of the answer settled heavily in the space between them. A few feet away, someone exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, but enough to break the silence for a moment. The officer extended the document back toward Ethan with both hands, the gesture careful, respectful in a way that had not been present before. Ethan accepted it without hesitation, folding it once again along the same lines, as if the process itself mattered. Richard's shoulders lowered just slightly, not in defeat, but in the subtle shift. That comes when control is no longer absolute. "There must be a process for this," he said, almost to himself, his eyes flicking briefly toward the officers, then back to Ethan. "If there has been an error, there has not been an error," the officer said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the attempt to reframe the situation. The words did not carry force, but they carried finality. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Heavier. The kind that does not invite interruption. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his sleeve lightly, a small, almost absent movement, then let his hand fall back to his side. "You saw what you expected to see," he said quietly. Richard did not respond right away. The statement lingered, not confrontational, but undeniable. And in that moment, surrounded by polished floors and bright lights, with the steady rhythm of departures continuing just beyond them, the difference between perception and reality stood fully exposed, leaving no room for anything else to hide. The silence that followed did not break all at once, it thinned slowly, like fog lifting under early morning light, revealing details that had always been there but were never truly seen, and in that quiet, something shifted not just in the space, but in the people standing within it. Richard Hayes remained still, his posture no longer rigid, but not relaxed either, suspended somewhere between control and realization, his eyes no longer scanning for authority to assert, but searching for something he could not immediately name. The polished floor beneath them reflected the overhead lights in long, clean lines, and for the first time, those reflections felt almost too sharp, too honest, as if the environment itself was no longer willing to soften what had just unfolded. Ethan Cole stood a few feet away, his presence unchanged, grounded in a calm that did not demand attention but held it anyway, his hands resting loosely at his sides, the folded document now still, no longer needing to prove anything. One of the officers shifted his stance slightly, his earlier formality replaced with a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken aloud, while the other glanced briefly toward the surrounding crowd, noticing the way people had stopped pretending to move on, the way they lingered just a second longer than necessary, drawn into a moment that felt larger than the individuals involved. A soft chime echoed overhead, followed by a boarding announcement for a flight bound west, the voice clear and steady, continuing the rhythm of the airport as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Richard drew in a breath, slow, controlled, but heavier than before, as if the air itself carried more weight now. He began, but the word did not lead anywhere. It lingered incomplete, suspended between intention and understanding. He looked at Ethan again, really looked, not at the surface, not at the worn coat or the dust along the edges, but at the stillness, the composure, the absence of reaction that now felt intentional rather than passive. I did not. He tried again, then stopped, his voice falling away before it could shape into something definitive. Ethan did not interrupt. He did not step forward or backward. He simply remained, allowing the moment to exist without forcing it in any direction. The first officer glanced between them, sensing that something quieter, something more internal, was unfolding, something that no procedure or protocol could guide. A traveler nearby adjusted the strap of her bag, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if even small actions needed to respect the weight of the moment. Another man lowered his phone completely, no longer recording, just watching. Richard's hand moved unconsciously to the edge of his jacket, smoothing the fabric as if restoring order to something that had slipped out of place. There are standards, he said finally, though the words sounded different now, less like a rule and more like a question he was asking himself. There are procedures we follow. Ethan's gaze remained steady, but there was something softer in it now, not sympathy exactly, but understanding. Procedures are only as good as the assumptions behind them, he said quietly. The words did not accuse. They did not demand. They simply settled into the space, clear and unembellished. Richard's eyes dropped briefly. Not to the floor, but somewhere just short of it, as if the ground beneath him no longer felt as certain as it had before. The officer closest to him shifted again, his voice calm, but carrying a clarity that marked a turning point. Sir, he said to Richard, we need to step aside for a moment and review this situation properly. It was not a command. It was not a confrontation. But it was no longer a suggestion either. Richard nodded slowly, the movement small, almost automatic, as if he was following a path that had already been set in motion. He glanced once more at Ethan, his expression no longer guarded, no longer certain, but open in a way that felt unfamiliar. I see, he said, though it was unclear whether he meant the situation, the man in front of him, or something deeper that had only just begun to surface. Ethan gave a slight nod in return, nothing more, no triumph, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement. The world around them began to move again, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, as conversations resumed and footsteps regained their rhythm, but the space between them held on to its stillness just a little longer, as if allowing the moment to settle fully before letting it go. And in that quiet, unspoken pause, something intangible but undeniable remained, not visible in the lights or the polished floor or the passing crowd, but present all the same, like a shift in direction that could not be undone once it had begun. Richard Hayes took a step to the side as the officer indicated, the movement slower than it should have been, as if each inch carried more weight than the last, and for the first time since the encounter began, He was no longer leading the direction of the moment but following it, guided by something outside his control. The polished tile beneath his shoes reflected his movement in a distorted line, no longer sharp, no longer certain, just a blurred outline shifting under the steady airport lights. The first officer walked beside him, not close enough to crowd, but near enough to signal that the situation had formally changed, his posture upright, his tone professional, yet now carrying a quiet authority that no longer deferred. "Sir," the officer said calmly, his voice low enough to remain contained within their immediate space. "We need to clarify your actions here and ensure everything aligns with airport conduct policies." Richard nodded once, though the motion felt automatic, detached from the certainty he once carried. His eyes flicked briefly back toward Ethan, who had not moved from his place near the bench, still standing with that same composed stillness, his presence no longer questioned, no longer challenged, but quietly undeniable. A few feet away, the second officer remained near Ethan, not as a guard, but as a formality, his stance respectful, his attention alert but no longer skeptical. The crowd had begun to loosen, some travelers continuing on with their routines, others lingering just enough to witness what came next, their curiosity now transformed into something more reflective, something quieter. Richard ran a hand along the edge of his sleeve again, smoothing the fabric without thinking, a small gesture that once represented control, but now felt more like an attempt to hold on to it. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said, his voice lowered, more measured, but no longer commanding. "I was enforcing protocol. That is my responsibility." The officer listened without interruption, his expression steady, his eyes focused not just on the words, but on the context behind them. "Protocol is important," the officer replied, his tone even. "But so is judgment, especially in situations involving executive clearance." The phrase landed with precision, not accusatory, but definitive. Richard's gaze shifted again, this time downward, not fully avoiding eye contact, but no longer meeting it directly. The terminal noise returned in layers around them, rolling suitcases, distant announcements, fragments of conversation weaving back into the space, but the clarity of this moment remained intact, isolated within its own quiet frame. Behind them, Ethan adjusted his stance slightly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his hands still relaxed at his sides, the folded document now resting calmly in his grasp. His expression had not changed, but there was something in his posture now that suggested closure, not in the sense of an ending, but in the understanding that the truth no longer needed to be proven. The officer near him spoke briefly into his radio, his voice low, relaying information that did not need to be heard by the surrounding crowd, his words efficient, precise. A response came back through a faint crackle, confirming something that had already become clear. Richard noticed the exchange, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in realization, as if each small detail was reinforcing a conclusion he could no longer deny. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, the question directed at the officer beside him, but carrying a weight that extended beyond procedure. The officer paused for a brief moment before answering, choosing his words with care. "We will need to document the interaction," he said. "Given the level of clearance involved, this will be reviewed by airport authority and airline administration." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The meaning settled clearly. Richard inhaled slowly, the breath deeper than before, his shoulders rising slightly, then lowering as he exhaled, as if releasing something he had been holding onto without realizing it. He glanced once more toward Ethan, and this time, there was no defensiveness in his expression, no attempt to reassert control, only recognition, quiet and unguarded. Ethan met his gaze briefly, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as a gesture of approval or forgiveness, but as acknowledgement of the moment as it was. The space between them, once filled with tension and assumption, now held something else entirely, something quieter, something that did not need words to define it. And as the officers began to guide Richard further aside, the world around them resumed its full motion, passengers moving, announcements continuing, the airport returning to its rhythm, but the imprint of what had just unfolded remained, steady and unspoken, like a line drawn that could not be erased. Richard Hayes stood just beyond the immediate flow of passengers now, the distance only a few steps, but enough to separate him from the version of himself that had stood so firmly moments before, and as the officer spoke quietly into his radio again, confirming details that no longer needed debate, Richard's attention drifted back to Ethan Cole with a focus that felt entirely different from before. There was no calculation in it now, no quick assessment or judgment, only observation, steady and unfiltered. Ethan had not moved far. He remained near the bench, his posture relaxed, his presence no longer questioned, no longer challenged, but simply accepted as it was. The overhead lights traced soft lines across the glass windows behind him, where a plane slowly pushed back from the gate, its engines beginning a low, distant hum that vibrated faintly through the terminal floor. The world had resumed, but the space between them still carried the quiet weight of what had been revealed. Richard took a slow breath, then another, as if recalibrating something internal that no policy or training had ever addressed. He stepped forward again, not with authority, but with intention, each movement measured, deliberate, as though he understood now that speed was no longer the point. The officer beside him did not stop him, only watched, recognizing the shift for what it was. When Richard reached a few feet from Ethan, he paused, the silence between them no longer tense, but open, waiting. For a moment, he said nothing. The words did not come easily. Not because they were complicated, but because they were simple in a way he was not used to. "I made an assumption," he said finally, his voice lower than before, but clear. The statement did not try to defend itself. It did not reach for explanation. It simply existed. Ethan's gaze met his, steady, unchanged, but there was a softness there now, not an expression, but in the absence of resistance. Richard nodded once, as if acknowledging something that had only just become visible to him. "I saw what I expected to see," he continued, the words echoing what had already been said, but now carrying a different weight, shaped by understanding rather than denial. He glanced briefly at the folded document in Ethan's hand, then back to his face. "And I acted on that." Without question. The admission settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable. A traveler walked past, the wheels of a suitcase clicking rhythmically against the tile, the sound briefly filling the silence before fading again. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, his hand brushing the edge of his coat, then stilling. "That happens more often than people realize," he said calmly. There was no edge to the words, no accusation, only a statement of fact, delivered without emphasis. Richard's eyes dropped for a moment, then lifted again, meeting Ethan's gaze directly this time, without the filter that had been there before. "It should not," he said. The response was immediate, but not defensive. It carried something else now, something closer to responsibility. The officer standing a few steps away observed quietly, saying nothing, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. The surrounding crowd had thinned, most travelers continuing on, though a few remained at a distance, their attention quieter now, less curious, more reflective, as if they understood that what mattered was no longer the spectacle, but the meaning beneath it. Richard's posture shifted again, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in release, as if he was no longer holding himself rigid against something that had already changed. "I cannot undo what already happened," he said, his voice steady, grounded in the present rather than reaching backward. "But I can acknowledge it." He paused, the space between words intentional, giving them weight without forcing it. "And I can do better moving forward." Ethan watched him for a moment, not evaluating, not measuring, just listening. Then he gave a small nod, the gesture simple, unembellished, but enough. It was not approval. It was not forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. The kind that did not erase the past, but allowed the present to stand on its own. The overhead announcement system chimed again, calling for final boarding at a nearby gate, the voice calm and routine, continuing the rhythm of departures and arrivals that defined the space. Ethan glanced briefly toward the windows, where the plane had begun its slow movement toward the runway, then back to Richard. "Respect does not come from titles," he said quietly. It comes from how you see people when you think no one is watching. The words settled into the air, clear and steady, not needing repetition. Richard nodded again, slower this time, as if the meaning was still unfolding within him. He did not respond right away. There was nothing immediate to say that would match the weight of what had just been spoken. And in that quiet, with the airport moving steadily around them, something real took shape, not loud, not dramatic, but lasting in a way that would not fade once the moment passed. The final boarding call echoed softly across the terminal, the voice calm and practiced, but now it felt different, as if it carried a quiet sense of closure rather than urgency, and beyond the wide glass windows, the aircraft began its slow, deliberate movement toward the runway, its lights blinking steadily against the fading afternoon sky. Ethan Cole turned his gaze toward it for a brief moment, watching the motion not with anticipation, but with a quiet familiarity, as though he had seen this scene unfold countless times from many different perspectives, and then he shifted his attention back to the space around him, where the moment that had just passed still lingered in subtle, almost invisible ways. The crowd had fully dispersed now, replaced by the steady rhythm of travelers moving with purpose, conversations resuming, footsteps blending into a continuous hum that filled the terminal once more. Yet something remained beneath it all, something quieter, something that did not need to be seen to be felt. Richard Hayes stood a few steps away, no longer at the center of anything, his posture no longer defined by authority or resistance, but by a stillness that suggested reflection, his eyes following Ethan not out of obligation, but out of something closer to awareness. He did not speak again. There was nothing left to say that would add to what had already been understood. The officers nearby had stepped back into their roles within the environment, their presence once again blending into the structure of the airport, though their earlier attention had left an imprint that did not fade as quickly as the crowd had. Ethan adjusted the fold of the document one last time, sliding it carefully into the inside pocket of his coat, the motion precise, almost ritual, as if it marked the closing of something that no longer needed to be proven. He then reached up briefly, brushing a small crease from his sleeve, a gesture so simple it might have gone unnoticed, yet it carried a quiet sense of order, of self, untouched by the assumptions that had been placed upon him. Without haste, he turned toward the boarding gate, his steps measured, steady, the distance ahead of him clear and unobstructed, and as he walked, the overhead lights traced a soft line along his path, reflecting faintly against the polished floor beneath him. Each step carried no weight of triumph, no visible reaction, only a calm continuation, as though the moment behind him had already been set aside, not forgotten, but placed exactly where it belonged. Near the gate, an attendant glanced up, her expression shifting almost instantly as recognition settled in, her posture straightening subtly, her voice lowering into a tone of quiet respect as she greeted him. But Ethan responded with the same even acknowledgement he had given throughout, no more, no less, his presence unchanged by the shift in how he was seen. Behind him, Richard remained where he was, watching the scene not as an observer of status, but as someone who had just witnessed the difference between perception and reality unfold in real time, and though the terminal around him continued with its usual precision, something in his perspective had altered in a way that would not easily return to what it had been. The aircraft outside began its gradual acceleration, the engines building in a low, steady hum that resonated through the glass, and for a brief moment, the entire scene seemed to align with that motion, forward, inevitable, leaving behind what no longer belonged. Ethan stepped through the gate without pause, disappearing into the corridor that led to the plane, his figure gradually obscured by the structure of the terminal, until only the empty space remained. Where he had stood, the lights continued to shine, the announcements continued to echo, the passengers continued to move, but the quiet imprint of the moment remained, not visible, not spoken, yet present all the same, like a line drawn beneath everything that had happened, marking not an ending, but a recognition that would carry forward long after the plane had left the ground.